In the winter of 1823, under skies as grey as ash and winds that gnawed bone like wolves, a crude wooden sign swung in the bitter wind above a crooked building at the edge of Hollow Creek, Marrow Sons, Funeral Services. It stood at the end of a dirt road no one travelled unless they had business with the dead. The house behind the parlour was built from rotted chestnut, its chimney bent like a snapped neck, its windows rarely lit from within. The townsfolk of Grisham's Hollow had long stopped asking questions about what happened inside those walls, and by the time the first body was found, it was already too late to count the others. The town itself was not marked on most maps. Nestled in a forgotten pocket of Pennsylvania, Grisham's Hollow was one of those colonial towns that history tried to scrub from memory, the kind of place where bloodlines didn't end. They looped back on themselves generation after generation until the whole place became one inbred, pulsing organ. Religion there was a private thing. So was punishment. What happened in the chapel was for God. What happened in the parlour was for the Marrow family. The patriarch, Enoch Marrow, was already an old man by then, a Civil War veteran who walked with a limp that came not from battle, but from something that had happened to him in childhood, something no one spoke of. Enoch's 3 sons, Elias, Abram, and little Josiah, helped run the business. Quiet, pale boys with matching eyes like burnt porcelain and a habit of speaking only in whispers. They said the youngest hadn't spoken aloud since his mother vanished in the flood of 1812. Locals claimed the flood took her, but others remembered what the preacher once muttered during a Sunday sermon. The earth don't swallow a woman like her unless she's been bled first. The first whispers began after the winter thaws, when the river broke and the frost gave way to black, soft soil. A child out trapping muskrats near the Marrow property returned with something else in his satchel, a jawbone, still pink at the root, still leaking. Sheriff Calloway dismissed it, said it was probably a butcher's cast-off or some unlucky farm pig. But his deputy, a boy named Hiram Wicks, wasn't so sure. And when Hiram followed the creek upstream one cold dusk and stepped into a clearing where the earth was unnaturally raised like ribs beneath skin, he made a discovery that should have ended the Marrow family right then and there. Instead, the next day, Hiram Wicks disappeared. His badge was found near the church steps, still pinned to his bloodless uniform. No body, no trace, no scream. Just one message scratched into the frost-glazed door of Marrow Sons in the dead of night. They do not bury the dead, they feed them. And no one dared knock again. When the spring rains came and the cemetery sank deeper into its own reflection, townspeople noticed something strange. Graves were shifting, not just from the wet soil, but with a regularity that felt intentional, like someone was moving the earth from underneath. But it wasn't until old Miss Harlan went to visit her husband's plot and found his coffin splintered open from within that the real questions began. No one believed her at first. Grief was a violent drug in Grisham's Hollow, and women too often drowned in it. But when the groundskeeper confirmed her story, murmuring about claw marks along the inside lid, the town turned cold with dread. That night, Marrow Sons closed early. No candlelight behind the curtains. No smoke from the chimney. It was the preacher, Reverend Malcolm Kane, who first suspected the truth, though he would never dare speak it in public. The Marrows handled every burial for 30 years, kept every death quiet, and every coffin sealed. But Kane noticed a pattern in the church's own records. Families who questioned the cost of burial often found themselves buried too, always under Enoch's care, always with a discount. The town doctor, Jonah Bell, once asked to inspect a body before it was laid to rest, an 8-year-old girl named Clara, who had died of lung rot, according to the Marrows. But her skin was bloated, her nails black, her teeth broken. "This isn't disease," Bell whispered to Kane. "This is torture." The next morning, Bell's house was found burned to the ground. His wife and son never turned up. And Kane, he stopped asking questions. But records leave trails, and when the new deputy, Ruth Vaughn, Hiram's cousin, was appointed by default, she took to the job with an obsession that frightened even her own kin. One night, lantern in hand, she snuck into the funeral home through the cellar doors. What she found in the ledgers would have and hair until her death. Dozens of entries listed the same dates, multiple burials on the same day, for people who had never been recorded as dead. Names that matched those of farmers who'd only recently moved into town, or of young wives who'd married into certain families, all under miscellaneous interments. Next to each name, a strange symbol, a circle within a triangle, filled in with charcoal. No prices, no ceremony, no mourning. But there was something else. Tucked behind the last page, stitched into the binding like a secret. A child's drawing. Crude, desperate, scrawled in red ink. It showed 5 figures standing around an open grave, and inside the grave, a man still alive, his eyes wide and mouth screaming. Beneath it, the child had written one phrase. He kept blinking. Vaughn tore the page out and fled, but the night swallowed her before she ever reached the sheriff. Her horse returned at dawn, alone, wet with sweat, its saddlebag torn clean through. No one ever found the drawing, and from that day on the ledger was locked. They say it's impossible to hear a whisper beneath 6 feet of earth, but in Grisham's Hollow the soil had memory, and it murmured. By the time spring deepened into summer, townsfolk reported a strange smell drifting from the rear of the Marrow property, not the ripe, sweet rot of bodies decaying in the summer heat, but something sharper, something synthetic, like scorched wax and iron filings. Enoch Marrow claimed it was simply new embalming methods imported from Europe. A scientific advancement, he told the town council, to give the dead more dignity. But few dared challenge him because of what happened to the last boy who did. Elijah Booth was 13, a gravedigger's son with a cleft lip and a tendency to wander. He had a fascination with the dead, not out of fear, but curiosity. And one afternoon, while his father napped drunk beneath the chapel eaves, Elijah crept down into the Marrow basement through an unlocked storm hatch behind the funeral home. He would not be seen again for 2 days. When he finally emerged, clothes soaked, feet bare, and eyes rimmed with blood, he didn't speak, not a word, not for the rest of his life. He refused food for weeks, tore his nails out in his sleep, and when the doctor tried to sedate him, Elijah bit a chunk from the man's hand and screamed over and over, "The boy's still moving. He has no skin, but he's still moving." The doctor, horrified and half-mad himself, began speaking to the preacher in private. They theorized Elijah had witnessed a botched embalming or worse, some unholy experimentation, but the truth was far stranger. That same month, a carpenter named Lyle Hess was contracted to repair the rotting joists beneath the Marrow home. He was a mute and spoke only through crude sketches in a little notebook tied to his belt. After 2 hours beneath the building, he climbed out white as bone and left without his tools. He never worked again. His daughter, when cleaning out his shack decades later, found one final sketch in the notebook, hidden behind pages of crosses and blank parchment. It showed a child in a chair, arms and legs bound, but not with rope, with sinew, human sinew. The child's face was too smooth, too shiny, like candle wax pulled taut over a skull. Its eyes, though, were perfectly clear, human. A caption underneath written in trembling hand, "They keep him fresh. He watches the coffins go down." Whispers returned to the town after that, rumors that the Marrows weren't burying the dead but using them, preserving select bodies for something unknown. Some said it was science, others said it was worship. A few dared utter the word immortality, but most simply crossed the street when walking past the funeral home. And every now and then, late at night, someone would swear they saw a flicker of candlelight through the basement vent, flickering in perfect rhythm, like a child blinking in the dark. By midsummer of 1823, the earth behind the Marrow funeral home had turned soft and sunken, like something bloated just beneath the surface. But no one dug, no one dared, because those who wandered too close, even during daylight, returned changed, or didn't return at all. A constable sent to inspect a suspected water leak behind the property walked into the grove and was found 2 days later wandering the edge of the hollow barefoot, chanting hymns backwards, his eyes milk-white and weeping. His clothes were soaked with something that reeked of formaldehyde and feces. Behind the marrow parlour, between the rear door and the forest line, sat a stone path no one remembered being built. It wasn't on any map, and none of the masons in Grisham's Hollow claimed to have laid it. 5 smooth stones formed a circle, black, flat, polished, but cold to the touch, even in direct sunlight. Locals called it the Bone Orchard, though no one had ever planted there. The grass around it grew pale, brittle, like it had been drained of its colour. And yet at night, passers-by claimed they saw silhouettes kneeling at its centre, not praying, listening. It was said that Enoch Marrow held private evening services once every new moon. No one knew who attended, no one was invited, but strange things happened on those nights. Dogs refused to go outside, chickens laid black eggs, and the air itself turned sour, like old copper and burnt meat. The undertaker's house would glow faintly from within, green, not orange, as if something unnatural was burning inside. The chimneys coughed thick smoke that smelled of boiling teeth. It was at this time that a drifter named Thomas Aldwych entered the Hollow. A war veteran turned mapmaker, Aldwych had been hired by the state to chart unclaimed land around the western edge of Pennsylvania. He was meticulous, curious, and skeptical of small-town superstition. But when he arrived in Grisham's Hollow and saw that entire parcels of land had been crossed out with ink so dense it cut through the parchment, he knew something was wrong. Aldwych tried to lodge in the town inn, but the owner refused him after sundown. "It's not a good time," she whispered. "The earth's listening tonight." He slept in his cart outside the chapel, but was awoken just after midnight by a sound he could never forget, the rhythmic scrape of something heavy being dragged across stone, then a thud, then a wet squelch, over and over, 6 times, then silence. The next morning he followed the sound's path back toward the Marrow property. The stone circle was still warm. At its center lay a smear of blood, hair, and something that looked like a child's molar, but no footprints. No sign of a body. He left town that night, rattled, his map half finished, but not before carving something strange into the chapel's door with the tip of his compass. Just 4 words. "They dig up first." No one saw Aldwych again. His cart was found burned just outside the township line. The blackened wheels were full of teeth. By the time autumn brushed its breath across Grisham's Hollow, the trees began shedding more than leaves. Animals went missing. Infants wailed through the night. A sulphuric mist coiled through the streets each dusk as if summoned from the belly of the town itself. The cemetery, once a simple slope of honest graves, had begun to bulge in strange places, rising mounds with no markers, no dates, and no records. But what disturbed the townspeople most was not what they saw. It was what they heard beneath the soil. Shallow thuds, hollow groans, and the unmistakable grind of wood against stone. They said you could hear it best standing on the western edge of the cemetery, just past the old sycamore tree. A sound like fingernails, slow, patient, methodical. As if someone, or something, was crawling toward the surface. It was there that gravedigger Vernon Pike made his final mistake. Pike had worked the graves for nearly 2 decades. A drunk, a thief, and a man without love, but not without curiosity. One evening, after noticing that a grave he had personally dug only a week prior was now sunken far deeper than he'd left it, he returned after hours with a shovel and a flask. It was a child's plot, no more than 4 feet down, marked only with a crude wooden cross. The name had been burned away by weather or by hand. But the moment his shovel struck wood, the earth seemed to sigh. He unearthed a coffin sealed with tar and wire. No hinges, no plaque. Just deep gouges across the lid, as though someone inside had tried to claw their way out. He pried it open with a crowbar, but found no body, only a bundle of hair, still braided, a porcelain doll's head with no eyes, and a note, folded delicately and tied with human sinew. It read, "The name was taken, not the soul." Pike, drunk and trembling, tried to rebury it, but when he returned to the grave's edge, he found it empty. No coffin, no hole, just flat, undisturbed soil. He ran to the sheriff that night, raving about ghosts and stolen children. Sheriff Calloway dismissed him until Pike produced the note and the doll's head. The sheriff went pale. He said nothing, just poured kerosene over the evidence and lit a match. 3 days later, Vernon Pike was found hanging from the bell tower of the chapel. His mouth was stuffed with hair. His eyes had been replaced with black stones. The town called it suicide. But his boots were still clean. No dirt, no scuff marks, as if he hadn't climbed anything at all. That week, a new coffin appeared in the back room of Marrow Sons, unmarked, unclaimed. The townspeople said nothing, but the next time a child went missing, they all knew exactly where not to look, and no one ever asked who the funeral was for. By October's end, the days in Grisham's Hollow grew shorter, not just in sunlight, but in time itself. Watches began ticking strangely, falling out of rhythm. The church bell would ring minutes too early or too late, and on some nights, when the moon was thin and crooked in the sky, townspeople swore they lost hours, finding themselves waking up in fields or rooms they hadn't entered, their hands and feet caked in black earth they didn't remember touching. The Marrow family, meanwhile, moved like shadows behind the frosted windows of their parlour, never seeming to age, never missing a step. The rumours were growing louder, but no one had proof, until Ruth Vaughan's younger brother, Micah, found the candle. It was discovered by accident in the abandoned tool shed behind the church. Micah was only 10, a quiet boy with a love for puzzles and scavenging, who spent his days sketching birds and collecting glass. That evening, while searching for scrap metal, he unearthed a small iron box beneath the floorboards, rusted shut, sealed with what looked like wax and ash. Inside was a single candle, pale, coiled, and wrapped in yellowed parchment. Its wick was embedded at the bottom, not the top. The note beside it read, "Burn at dusk. Let it finish. Do not speak." Micah, curious and unafraid, lit it behind the chapel that night. What happened next would unravel the last threads of silence in the hollow. The flame sparked green, then blue, and began to burn downwards, melting wax, not from the top, but from the base, climbing toward the top as if time had reversed. With each inch the flame devoured, the air grew colder. The leaves surrounding the chapel curled inward, frost forming along their veins. The birds fled, even the wind fell silent. And then the voices started. Not loud, but layered, like hundreds whispering at once just beneath the hearing. Micah dropped his sketchbook. As he clutched his ears, he tried to blow the flame out, but it would not yield. It burned slowly, steadily, feeding on itself, spitting no smoke but casting shadows that did not match the objects around them. The last thing Micah remembered was a voice, his mother's voice, even though she had died 5 years prior, saying one word from the flame: "Down." He was found the next morning curled in the chapel's lectern, eyes wide, pupils gone. His sketchbook was open beside him. Every page had been filled in the night with crude charcoal drawings, coffins piled in. As November clawed its way into Grisham's Hollow, silence became the loudest thing in town. Birds stopped singing. The clock in the chapel tower froze at 3:07 and refused to tick again. Even the river, once swollen with rain and runoff, slowed to a near standstill, as if time itself was thickening. And in that silence came something worse, the return of the hollow-eyed widow. She had no name, not anymore. Her real name had been stripped from the town records long ago, burned from church logs and court ledgers alike. But she had lived once, before the Marrow family arrived. Her husband had owned the land where the funeral home now stood. They'd kept livestock, grew root vegetables, lived simply and faithfully. Then, in the fall of 1802, everything changed. The widow returned from market one afternoon to find her home burned to the soil, her husband's skin nailed to the barn door, and her children vanished without a trace. She did not scream. She did not cry. She simply walked into the woods with nothing but her wedding ring and a Bible missing half its pages. She was presumed dead within a year. But now, 20 years later, she returned. First seen standing outside the chapel, barefoot and wrapped in a shawl of twine and feathers, her eyes were an unnatural black, glassy and bottomless. She spoke only in fragments, but what she carried under her arm would soon shake the hollow to its rotten core. a book of names, bound in leather that twitched in candlelight. Its pages were slick and thin, like dried skin. Every name written inside belonged to someone buried by the Marrows. Some were marked with an X, others were underlined, but a very few, were written in red. And those names matched the missing. Reverend Kane refused to touch the book, claiming it throbbed in his presence. Sheriff Calloway declared it a hoax, despite the eerie accuracy of its content. But Ruth Vaughn took it, hid it, and began cross-referencing the names with her own notes. Records salvaged from the doctor, sketches from Micah, accounts whispered by widows who had nothing left to lose. What she found was impossible. Every 33 days, without fail, a red-marked name vanished. No body, no struggle, no witnesses. It didn't matter where they were. In their homes, in the woods, surrounded by family. They simply ceased. And always, within 2 days, a new coffin would appear in the Marrow Parlour's back room. The first frost came early that year, hard as iron and white as bone. It blanketed the hollow like a burial shroud, sealing in the whispers, the blood, and the stench of secrets too old to die. Ruth Vaughn had not slept in 3 nights. She knew her time was narrowing. The name in the widow's book, her brother Micah's, was a noose tightening around both their necks. But where others shrank, Ruth moved. She had inherited her cousin Hiram's determination, and perhaps something darker, an unspoken rage that burned hotter than fear. So, she made a plan. On the night of December the 1st, she broke into Marrow Sons. It wasn't difficult. The side window had always been loose, and Enoch Marrow, ancient by now, more corpse than man, rarely locked anything. She slipped inside through a storage room thick with the smell of lye and mold. The parlour was dead silent, not even the creak of floorboards under her boots. The embalming room was colder than she expected, its slab glinting like a butcher's altar. The instruments were arranged in obsessive order, scalpels, clamps, bone saws, things meant to preserve, not kill. And yet every tool was stained. None had been cleaned in months. It was behind this table, beneath a trapdoor hidden under a crate marked human remains, private, that Ruth found the staircase. It wasn't made of wood. It was iron, black, damp, and spiraling straight into the earth like a screw twisted into flesh. It had no railing, no torch brackets, nothing to hold on to. She descended with a single lantern, each step groaning as if remembering those who'd walked it before. The walls were wet, they pulsed, and with every foot she dropped, the air grew hotter, but not like fire, more like a fever, like breath. After 27 steps, she reached the bottom. It was a chamber, circular, low ceiling, packed dirt, but the thing that filled it, a massive wheel made entirely of bones, made her knees buckle. Skulls, femurs, jawbones, ribs, all arranged in a spiraling mechanism that turned slowly on its own, grinding endlessly with a sound like teeth on stone. Pinned to its face were bodies, not corpses, people, still breathing but eyeless, skin peeled thin and taut, mouths sewn shut. Their fingers twitched in unison with the wheel's motion. One of them was still wearing a sheriff's badge. Ruth dropped her lantern. The chamber glowed anyway. From behind the wheel came a voice, wet, soft, and childlike. "Micah is ready. We just need the other half." She ran, scrambled back up the stairs, her palms shredded by rusted iron. Snow came to Grisham's Hollow like a mercy, covering the rot with a sterile white sheet. It blanketed the crooked fences, silenced the groaning earth, and buried the crooked gravestones that leaned like drunkards whispering their secrets. But it did not cover the smell. Beneath the frost, beneath the frozen soil, something had turned. Something was feeding, and the smell that rose from the Marrow property was not of death. It was older than death. Hungrier. Ruth Vaughn, now a pariah in her own town, kept to the chapel's crypt. There she laid out every piece of evidence she'd collected, Micah's drawings, the widow's book, the child's candle stub, her own torn gloves soaked with embalming fluid. But one object made her hands tremble more than the others, a burlap sack left at the chapel door the night after Micah vanished. It had no tag, no note, just a bundle of hair, a strip of nightgown lace, and something heavy. Inside were teeth, dozens of them. Human, by the look of it, small, yellowed, some cracked, but not all from the same mouth. Some were clearly baby teeth, others were worn by age, almost ground to the root. But when Ruth brought them to the church basement and poured them onto the stone table under lamplight, her breath caught in her throat. Each one had been carved. Symbols, letters, tiny intricate marks etched with the precision of a jeweler. She counted 26 teeth in all, one for every letter of the alphabet. One of them, marked with an R, was still wet, still warm. The widow appeared that same night, as if summoned. She did not knock. She simply stood in the aisle of the chapel like a ghost half-remembered. Her shawl dripped with melted snow. Her eyes were gone, 2 smooth patches of pale skin. Yet she moved without hesitation, as if she could still see. She approached Ruth and spoke a name in a voice that sounded like wind moving through ash. These are not the teeth of the dead. These are the keys of the buried. Ruth demanded answers. Who had taken Micah? What lived beneath the funeral home? What did the bone wheel feed? The widow said nothing, but laid a single page on the altar, torn from her own book of names. It contained no names, only numbers. Dates, to be precise, every 33 days. The next was marked in red. December 29th, and beside it in delicate handwriting, mouth of the hollow opens, teeth must be placed. Ruth examined the teeth again. In each groove, in each carved rune, she saw something pulsing, tiny threads of red like capillaries. The teeth were not dead. They were waiting. She buried them in By the final week of December, Grisham's Hollow had fallen into a hush so unnatural it seemed orchestrated. Children no longer cried. The chapel bell, once frozen at 3:07, now rang on its own, 3 times, always just before midnight. And across town, residents began placing cloth over their mirrors and keeping nails in bowls of salt at every windowsill. No one spoke the Marrow name aloud anymore. It wasn't fear. It was reverence. A learned obedience, like a village living in the belly of something larger than itself. And then came the knocking. It began in the funeral home, as most things did. A coffin had been delivered from elsewhere, wrapped in rusted chains and marked not with a name, but with a word burned into the lid. Returned. The delivery man, an outsider from upstate, refused to speak. He left it at the door and fled before being paid. Enoch Marrow himself brought the box inside. 3 hours later, townspeople walking past Marrow Sons heard a sound that rattled the teeth in their skulls. 3 slow knocks from inside the coffin, then silence, then again. Always 3. Knock, knock, knock. The funeral home remained locked, but the sound continued throughout the night. Sheriff Calloway was called. He arrived with lantern and pistol, pale with age and fear, his badge rusted from months of neglect. He entered the parlor with Reverend Kane. Only they would see what was inside. What they witnessed was never spoken of publicly, but Reverend Kane resigned his post that night and walked straight into the river at dawn, hymns spilling from his mouth as the current took him. His body was never recovered. Sheriff Calloway went home and hung his badge above the fireplace. He didn't leave his home again. Ruth Vaughn, hearing of the incident, returned to the chapel vault where she had buried the 26 carved teeth in consecrated soil, but the dirt had been disturbed. But no, not disturbed, peeled back like skin from a wound. The teeth were gone. In their place was a note, scratched into the stone in what looked like fingernail. The tongue will follow. She knew what had to be done. Ruth returned to the funeral home on December 28th, the eve of the Hollow's next feeding. She waited until midnight. She wore no shoes, brought no weapon. She slipped through the same cellar hatch Micah had once used, descended the iron staircase, and found the wheel of bone turning faster than ever. The bodies on its surface had multiplied. There were now 7. Each wore the face of someone believed to be missing. Each wept in silence. But the knocking was no longer coming from above. It echoed from beneath. Below the wheel, in the dirt, a second coffin had been uncovered, this one lined with mirrors, its interior black as pitch. And still, the knocking. Ruth knelt, her hand shaking as she pressed her palm to the lid. 3 knocks. She knocked once in return. The coffin knocked back. Then, slowly, as the wheel shuddered and the air thickened with the smell of wet ash, a voice rose from the box, not spoken, but felt inside her spine. "You are the tongue." Ruth staggered back, heart pounding. The coffin creaked, the lid shifted, and from within, a whisper clawed its way into her mind. Not Micah's voice, but her own. The morning after Ruth Vaughn vanished beneath the embalming room, the hollow awoke to a snowfall too quiet, too thick. It blanketed every roof, choked every chimney, and muffled even the crows. By noon the snow stopped, but in its place came something more disturbing. Every mirror in town cracked clean down the middle, not shattered, not spidered, just one precise line, as if a blade had been drawn across the surface from the inside. And all across Grisham's Hollow, the same phrase appeared, etched in the frost of windows, too perfect to be accidental. "Open. It is time." Inside the chapel crypt, Father Abram Marrow's photograph was missing. Until then, no image of the second-born Marrow son had ever been captured. He was rarely seen in daylight and never appeared in town records, portraits, or even funeral announcements. But in 1819, a traveling photographer passed through the hollow and claimed to have taken a candid photograph of the Marrow family during a funeral procession. He died a week later, and the image was lost, buried with him. Or so they thought. Now, more than 4 years later, that same photo had been slipped beneath the chapel door, dry despite the snow, wrapped in wax paper and sealed with a single tooth. The photo showed the Marrow family in a semicircle outside the parlor. Enoch, Elias, little Josiah, and one figure that should not have been there. Behind them stood a tall man in an undertaker's coat, one hand resting gently on a coffin's lid. His face was blurred, not by movement or error, but as if the lens itself had recoiled. The edges of his frame were too sharp, his fingers were impossibly long, and though the image was taken in daylight, he cast no shadow. But worse was the back of the photograph. Someone had written in pale brown ink, almost dried blood, "He is not the last. He is the first." Father Abram was buried alive, and what rose was not Abram. The town doctor, once skeptical, now delirious from months of silence and grief, began to study the photograph obsessively. He swore the figure moved when he turned away. Once he claimed the hand on the coffin had shifted positions. When the doctor tried to burn the photograph, his fireplace refused to light. The coal turned wet. His chimney howled like a throat with no tongue. That night, the doctor's house was found gutted. No sign of entry, no body, just ash, the smell of burnt flowers, and a single object placed neatly on the hearth, the photograph, now stained with salt. And from that point on, anyone who looked too long at it claimed to see a reflection of themselves standing behind the Marrow family, mouth stitched shut, eyes hollow, hands raised in prayer. The photo was brought to the sheriff's house for safekeeping. The next day, his house burned to the ground. But the photograph didn't burn. It was found in the center of the ash pile, untouched. And this time, the coffin lid was open. By the first days of the new year, Grisham's Hollow felt hollow in more than name. Entire houses stood empty, not from abandonment, but from erasure. Family portraits faded from the walls, furniture warped as if under pressure, and entire rooms suddenly inaccessible. Doors led to solid walls, windows showed only blackness. The town itself was rearranging, like a thing in pain curling into itself to hide the wound. Inside the funeral home, a new room appeared. It hadn't been there before, not on any blueprint, not in the recollection of the gravediggers or apprentices who had trained under Enoch. But there it was, tucked between the embalming parlor and the supply corridor. A narrow black door, low to the ground with no handle, only a keyhole, and no key. The new undertaker's apprentice, a quiet boy named Reuben Fletch, barely 17, was the first to notice it. The door, he said, would only appear at dusk. It had no trim, no frame, just darkness, cut into the wall like a wound stitched shut with paint. He made the mistake of knocking. On the third night of knocking, the door answered back, not with words, but with a sound. A wet, pulsing inhale, like lungs learning to breathe for the first time in centuries. The keyhole glistened, as if lined with something organic. Reuben stepped back and fled, but the sound followed him in his sleep. He began waking with bruises in the shape of hands around his neck. He carved crosses into his walls. He stopped speaking altogether. Then, just as suddenly, he vanished. His room found filled with feathers, broken glass, and a single boot facing the wrong direction. But the door remained. Ruth Vaughn, though presumed missing, had left behind notes buried deep in the chapel's crawlspace. Charcoal sketches of that very door, its dimensions marked, its location precise. But in her drawings, something was scrawled beside it in a language. Age no one recognized, runes or glyphs that spiraled in on themselves. A linguist from Philadelphia, summoned in desperation, analyzed Ruth's sketches and left in a frenzy, refusing payment. Before departing, he wrote one sentence and pinned it to the chapel wall. "It's not a door, it's a lid." Soon after, the walls of the funeral home began to rot from within. Paint blistered, wood grew damp, and the door grew taller each night, inch by inch, until it stood nearly as tall as a man. The townspeople grew restless. 3 more children vanished. 2 coffins were placed on display in the parlor without any family names, and on the next new moon, the door finally creaked open. No one saw who or what stepped through, but the apprentice's boot was placed neatly in front of the altar the next morning. Inside it, a human tongue perfectly preserved, and in the funeral home's front window, written backwards in condensation, "The tongue has returned. The throat opens next." The old chapel on Weaver's Hill had stood for nearly a century, its foundation laid before the town even bore a name. But beneath its bloodstone floor, past the wine cellar and the priest's chambers and the ossuary that hadn't held real bones in decades, there was another level, one that had never been spoken of in sermons or blueprints. Ruth Vaughn had found it, long before she vanished, and called it in her notes, the throat. For years it had been sealed shut with prayer and salt. Now the salt was gone, the prayers unsaid. The iron hatch leading down had been torn open from the inside. At first it was only a rumor, whispers among the choir boys who said they heard voices humming beneath their feet during evening psalm. Then the caretaker's dog refused to enter the nave, growling low at the pulpit and howling whenever the bell rang. But it wasn't until the first Mass of January, when Reverend Talbot stood to deliver his sermon and began bleeding from the eyes, that anyone dared admit it. Something beneath the chapel had awakened. A search party formed. 4 men, armed with lanterns, ropes, and the town's last remaining Bible. They descended into the undervault beneath the apse, where crypts had once been walled off and forgotten. The air grew colder with every step, thick with the smell of iron and wet paper. Then they found it. A tunnel. Carved by no man, too smooth to be natural. It pulsed slightly at the edges, as if it were breathing. The walls were slick with moisture and lined with what looked like scripture, but not in any known language, rows of symbols repeating etched into the stone like scars. One man refused to go further and turned back. The remaining 3 continued. They were never seen again. 3 nights later, the man who turned back was found crucified upside down in his own barn. His arms were dislocated. His lips were sewn shut, not with twine, but with hair. His eyes had been replaced with small white stones, on his chest carved with precision. The voice entered him. He denied it. The town began to unravel. Mothers refused to send their children to school. The chapel was abandoned. The bell tower stood silent, and those who passed near it at night reported hearing a voice beneath the floorboards, slow and deliberate, whispering prayers that sounded like gurgled drowning. Then one night the bell rang 13 times. No one touched the rope. And that's when the earth opened. A sinkhole, sudden and silent, swallowed the front steps of the chapel, revealing a spiral staircase carved not in stone but in bone, human vertebrae locked end to end, leading down into blackness. At the base, barely visible in the lantern light, was a stone seal carved with an open mouth and 7 tongues. And above it, freshly painted in crimson, "The throat is ready. Feed it." The town sealed the hole with limestone and prayer, but limestone cracks, and prayer in Grisham's Hollow no longer held weight. It was sometime in late January when the Marrow family's original funeral ledger was discovered, not by a gravedigger or a historian, but by a group of boys daring each other to sneak into the now abandoned chapel. They had brought lanterns and laughter, but both ran dry the moment they stepped into the nave. The laughter turned to silence, and silence in Grisham's Hollow always meant something was listening. The ledger was hidden beneath the altar stone, wrapped in wax cloth and bound with wire. Its cover was dry as dust and smelled faintly of ammonia and lilac. But when they opened it, the ink was still wet. The first page was normal, if anything could be called that here. Names, dates, causes of death, and burial plots. Infants, soldiers, spinsters, poxed and poisoned alike. It began in 1798 and carried on with grim precision, until it didn't. The handwriting didn't change, the paper didn't yellow, but somewhere past the middle of the book, the names stopped aging. One girl, Hannah Lee, was listed as buried in 1806, then again in 1804, then again in 1802, and each time a new detail emerged. Eyes remained open, heartbeat irregular after embalming, screamed once after lowering, and the dates were counting backwards. Each new burial entry was older than the last, as if time had been inverted beneath the soil, as if the dead were being called back up, their stories retraced in reverse, their deaths undone word by word. Eventually, the ledger no longer listed deaths at all, just phrases, short, cruel, precise. It watched me from the mirror. Her blood ran up the wall. He is building a body from the ones we failed. She was only dead on the outside. And then, one entry with no name, no date, just a drawing. A circle of 7 coffins surrounding a spire of teeth rising like a tower. At the center, a child curled in the fetal position, covered in eyes. The boys left the chapel screaming. One never spoke again. Another was found days later attempting to dig into the chapel's foundation with his bare hands, nails cracked and bleeding, mumbling over and over, "We're not burying them, we're planting them." The ledger was taken to the sheriff. He read 3 pages before gouging out his own eyes with a communion spoon. He lived for 2 more days, tied to the bed in the apothecary's attic, whispering things in a language no one knew, though some claimed to recognize ancient Latin, mixed with nursery rhymes. On the morning of his death, all the clocks in Grisham's Hollow stopped, and began ticking backward. The ledger has never been seen again. But those who enter the chapel say they hear the pages turning softly behind the altar, like something inside is still writing, still remembering, still waiting. And each night, a new grave appears in the churchyard. No name, no headstone, only soil, freshly turned, and a faint humming coming from below. By the 2nd week of February, the grave diggers in Grisham's Hollow began to whisper of a problem no one had ever encountered in a town built on death. The bodies were not rotting. 3 fresh burials, 2 men and 1 infant, had been laid to rest in the frozen earth with proper rites sealed in pine and prayer. But when the snow melted early that year and a hunting dog unearthed one of the plots, the coffin was found pristine. The wood hadn't warped, the nails hadn't rusted, and the body inside, still warm. His name was Alaric Bent, 37, died from a fever that spread through the mill house. But when the coffin was cracked open, his lips were pale pink, his eyes open, his chest, some claimed, still moved. He was burned that same night in the town square, on a pyre of saltwood and birch, as the townsfolk recited verses not from the Bible, but from Ruth Vaughan's stolen notebooks. The second coffin was exhumed the next morning, a baby girl, no more than 6 months old, wrapped in violet cloth. When the casket lid was removed, she was found sitting upright, mouth stuffed with twine, eyes replaced by polished onyx. The third was never found. Only the grave remained caved in from within, as if the coffin had dug its way out. The townspeople began to panic. Elders spoke of ancestral sins buried in bone and soil. Old mothers clutched rosaries made from teeth. A gathering was held in the abandoned funeral home where the remaining clergy and midwives attempted to bless the foundation with oil and ash. The oil turned black. The ash hissed. And from beneath the embalming table came the sound of scratching. That night, the cemetery began to change. Gravestones shifted, some sank halfway into the soil, others turned backwards. One split down the center, revealing hollow space beneath it. The iron fence around the graveyard twisted inward like it was being pulled. And the coffins, those that were not yet buried, began to change. Workers reported wooden boxes that bled when touched. One lid was found growing hair, another pulsed softly as if it had a heartbeat. A third coffin was so cold it burned the skin, and inside it a voice whispered in a tone like gravel being crushed. Not yet, not ready, not full. It became clear the Marrow family had never intended the funeral home to serve the dead. It had been built for containment, for storage, for feeding something that had no name in the spoken world. A ledger of burials was found rewritten in red ink with 3 words scrawled across the top: inventory, not memorial. No more bodies were buried after that. They were burned, drowned, abandoned in the woods. But it didn't matter. Each morning, the graveyard would contain one new coffin, nailed shut with black iron, humming faintly with a melody no one could place. A lullaby, or a warning. Either way, it was learning to sing. In the final winter that the Marrow family operated their funeral home, the youngest son, Elias Marrow, was tasked with the embalming. He was just 17, a quiet boy with skin as pale as candle wax and eyes that never quite seemed to blink. Unlike his brothers, Elias did not drink, did not speak unless addressed, and did not attend the weekly sermons. He lived in the basement of the funeral home, alone, beneath the cooling slabs and fluid tanks, and it was said by the laundress that he never once took a breath while sleeping. Because, of course, he never slept. The neighbors complained of noises coming from the parlor at night. Not footsteps, but low incantations, like something being read in repetition. And sometimes, just after 3 a.m., a sharp metallic scream would ring out from the floorboards, the kind of sound steel makes when bent beyond its will. The townspeople wrote it off as the settling of old pipes, but those who dared to get close enough to the cellar windows told a different story, of candles burning black, of shadows moving in ways that ignored the laws of light. Elias kept meticulous notes in his personal journal. It was discovered decades later, hidden beneath a false drawer in the embalming table. His first entries were clinical, methodical. He noted body temperature, stiffness, the rate at which blood pooled in extremities, but slowly the writing changed, became frantic, obsessed. One entry simply read, "The bodies remember, the fluids preserve more than just flesh." Another. She whispered her name through the drain. It was my name. And then the handwriting shifted, becoming angular, carved into the page with a dry nib, no longer resembling English or even Latin, just rows of symbols that resembled human limbs bent in impossible shapes, stitched together like sentences. On one page, dated March 3rd, 1823, he wrote, "The embalming fluid is the inking. It does not want to leave." The mortuary began to change. The walls began to sweat. Not moisture, but a thin, oily substance that stained the hands and left behind a scent of iron and honey. One maid swore she saw the embalming tubes slither when touched, recoiling like serpents when sunlight came through the window. Another reported seeing a body twitch on the slab, 2 weeks dead, no heart, no lungs, but still mouthing silent words. When the town physician attempted to confront Elias, he found the boy sitting motionless in the embalming chair, surrounded by 7 coffins filled not with corpses but with mirrors. In each one, Elias's reflection stood smiling, though his real face remained still and pale. The physician fled. 2 nights later, the entire basement went dark. When it was opened again by force, Elias was gone. So were the mirrors. In their place, a circle had been carved into the concrete, a spiral of embalming needles with a single tooth placed in the center. It was not human, and it pulsed. Some say Elias never left. that he moved beneath the house, beneath the graves, becoming something that embalms not the dead, but the very concept of death, preserving it, feeding it, waiting for us to forget how to rot. The funeral home, for all its horrors, had one room no one ever entered. Even the Marrow brothers avoided it. It was not locked by key or nail, but by silence. A silence that stretched so thick and absolute, it muffled even the breath in your lungs. They called it the sealed room, though no official blueprint showed its existence. It was located directly beneath the viewing parlor, beneath the floorboards where mourners stood and wept and whispered final prayers, unaware that something below them was always listening. The door was flat against the floor, hidden beneath a velvet rug and a walnut coffin stand that never moved. But those who swept the floors, especially the children hired to polish the wood before viewings, said the rug would sometimes ripple, as if something beneath it was breathing. And more than once, someone knocked, not from above, but from inside the floor. Only one person ever dared to open it. Her name was Thalia Rook, an apprentice mortician brought in from Easton. She had no fear of the Marrow family. She had dealt with plague carts, mass graves, and things far fouler in the coal towns. But when she asked Elias Marrow about the sealed door, he did not answer with words. He simply looked up from his autopsy, wiped his scalpel clean, and whispered, "It feeds differently." On a night when the family was away, burying a set of twins who died with the same bruise on their chests, Thalia pried open the floor. Beneath the rug was not wood, but salt, a thick, compact slab of it, veined with rust. She struck it with a chisel. It screamed, not a loud scream, but something that slid directly behind her eyes, and then the salt cracked, revealing a keyhole shaped like a human mouth. She used her own blood to open it. What she found beneath the floor was not a room, but a cavity, like a wound or a throat. Its walls were soft and black, pulsing like lungs, lined with what looked like tiny arms, sewn shut at the wrists. At the center sat a slab of bone, not carved but grown, and on it, an object wrapped in burial shrouds soaked in oil. Thalia later described the moment she unwrapped it, or tried to, because as soon as the cloth was touched, it unspooled itself, like it had been waiting, and beneath it was something so wrong, so malformed, that she could never bring herself to name it aloud. Only this: it was not dead. It was never alive. It had no shape. But it remembered mine. She fled the town the next morning. By the time anyone noticed, the sealed door had closed itself, and the rug was back in place. But those who stepped into the viewing parlor after that, especially children, complained of a low thudding beneath the floor, not constant, not regular, like a heartbeat that didn't belong to any one body, and the floorboards began to bow ever so slightly, as if the house was trying to give birth. In the spring of 1824, 6 months after the last funeral was held at the Marrow home, a satchel of letters was discovered beneath the steps of the town's derelict post office. The mail carrier had disappeared the previous October, last seen walking toward the Marrow property in a storm. Many assumed he had been lost to the nearby floodplains, but the letters he carried, damp, unmailed, addressed in various trembling hands, told a different story. Every letter was addressed to the same person, Reverend Charles Woolner, a retired exorcist who had once served the Hudson River congregation before being defrocked for unsanctioned rites. The messages were written by different townsfolk, mothers, doctors, even one sheriff, yet each letter carried the same tone: desperation, not just of illness or grief, but of something noticed too late, a dread creeping in around the edges of everyday life. They wrote of funerals gone wrong, of children speaking backwards in their sleep, of birds that flew in circles above the graveyard at dusk. One letter, dated August the 12th, 1823, read, "I buried my son on the 7th day. When I returned on the 8th, I found him walking toward the river with a candle in his mouth. He will not look at me. Please come." Another simply said, "My wife has taken to weeping in corners, not from grief, but from guilt. She says she remembers what it was like before she was born, that something is pulling her back." The handwriting grew more erratic as the dates progressed. Some were barely readable, scratched onto the page with burnt twigs, inked in blood or coal dust. A few contained diagrams of rooms with impossible geometries, staircases that looped back into themselves, coffins that opened into tunnels, symbols shaped like flayed animals woven into spirals. One letter contained no words at all, just a single tooth pressed between the folds of paper. A tooth, made of wood. None of the letters reached Reverend Woolner. He had vanished from public life in 1819 after claiming to have exorcised a non-human trinity from a plague hospital near Albany. No return address was ever found, but inside the satchel was a note written on thick grey vellum tucked between the letters. He cannot hear you. The voices already made their claim. What you buried is not what you lost. After the discovery, the townspeople tried to burn the letters, but the fire refused to take. The paper smoked, hissed, turned black, but never crumbled. It simply grew wet, as if the ink was sweating its own memory. So they buried them, not in the graveyard, but in the swamp near the edge of town. Even now, the ground refuses to hold grass where they were placed, and in spring, when the fog rolls in, you can sometimes see shapes in the mist. Stooped figures walking in circles, holding letters that will never be read. And in your sleep, if you dream of them, they will whisper, "We tried to warn you, but the dead send no mail." Of all the legends whispered about the Marrow family, none caused more terror among the townsfolk than what came to be known as the choir beneath the pit. It began after the funeral of Margaret Bell, an orphan girl of 13, found dead with her mouth sewn shut and fingers fused together as if melted. Her body was not claimed by family. The Marrows took her in, buried her themselves. But on the 7th night after her interment, a sound rose from the earth. Not the groaning of roots or the creak of settling coffins. It was singing. Soft at first, high bell-like voices humming a hymn no one recognized. Not in Latin, not in English. Older. The tune wound its way through the fog like a thread pulling at the soul. Some said it was beautiful. Others wept uncontrollably when they heard it. A few were driven into seizures. It didn't come from the church. It didn't come from any choir loft. It rose from behind the Marrow home, specifically from the drainage pit that had been dug generations earlier to funnel floodwaters away from the graves. By then, the pit had grown wide and black, its bottom never fully visible, even at noon. For years it had been ignored, fenced off, forgotten. But now the villagers gathered at its rim, listening to the sound rise up from its endless dark, like a lullaby for bones. The sheriff sent a deputy to investigate. He lowered a rope into the pit with a lantern tied to his belt. The lantern was still falling when the rope snapped. They never heard him scream, but they did hear his voice join the song. From that night on, the singing continued. Every 7th day, always at nightfall. Each time, more voices joined. A new harmony, a new verse, a new breathless vibrato that didn't quite match human lungs. Witnesses said it wasn't just sound, it was presence, a vibration that filled your mouth with the taste of dust and copper and left your fingertips trembling for hours. And always you remembered a face you had never seen looking up at you from under the earth. Elias Marrow was seen standing by the pit more than once, not with fear, but reverence. Some say he conducted the song with his fingers twitching in rhythm, eyes rolled back like a puppet communing with its maker. Others claimed he fed something into the hole, bones, salt, even the tongue of a rabid dog that had attacked the preacher's wife. When asked, Elias only replied, "They have found their choir master. They do not need mouths anymore." Attempts were made to fill the pit, but every time the townsfolk tried, pouring in gravel, cement, even fire, they found it empty again the next day, as if the pit had digested their efforts, as if it had never been filled at all. And now, when the wind is right, travelers swear they hear it still, a chorus of the dead, harmonizing with a grief that does not belong to them. A sorrow learned after burial, taught by something older than God. Something that does not speak, but sings. It was Elias's youngest daughter, Alma Marrow, who first spoke of the mirror room. She was 6 years old when she began describing a space in the house that no one else could find. a narrow chamber lined floor to ceiling with tarnished glass, lit only by candles that never cast shadows. She said it was behind a door that only opened when you were alone and afraid. Alma claimed the mirrors didn't reflect what you looked like. They reflected what you were hiding, secrets, sins, illnesses not yet diagnosed. One pane showed her mother crying into a crib that had long since vanished. Another showed Elias, dressed not in mourning black, but in blood-red vestments, whispering into the open chest cavity of a corpse that breathed back. At first, her siblings dismissed it as a child's dream, but then Alma stopped speaking altogether. Not from fear, she simply said nothing more was left to say. And in her silence, she began drawing obsessively on the walls of her bedroom, hundreds of tiny rectangles, each with faces looking out. Some with eyes gouged, some with mouths sewn, some with neither, but all smiling. Then the others began to see it. One by one, members of the Marrow household stumbled upon the mirror room, always by accident, always in moments of weakness. The eldest son found it after opening a broom closet and suddenly stepping into darkness. Elias's wife found it when she followed what she thought was the sound of her own mother singing through a wall. And each who entered came back changed, not broken but emptied, like something inside had been traded and they weren't sure what they'd lost. What terrified them most wasn't the reflections, it was the other face. Because in each mirror, beneath the flickering light, there stood a second figure, behind them. No matter how fast they turned, it was never visible in the room itself, but always in the glass, watching, leaning closer. It did not mimic their expressions. It smiled when they wept. It frowned when they laughed. It moved when they were still. And one night when Elias entered the room himself, hoping to understand the gift or curse he'd been given, he did not return. Only his reflection did. The family found him days later, wandering the halls, hands covered in mercury. He could speak only in whispers, and every time he passed a mirror, he turned his head violently away. When asked what he'd seen, he whispered just 5 words. "I wasn't the first one." They sealed the room, not with locks but names, the names of the dead, painted above the doorway, scrawled on the walls in their own blood, etched into the mirror frames. But glass remembers. And sometimes, when the moon is strong, light will reflect down a hallway that doesn't exist, leading you back to that narrow door. If you enter, it will shut behind you, the candles will light, and you'll see yourself, not who you are, who you were supposed to be, before they rewrote you. After the funeral home was abandoned in 1825, the Marrow property became a local legend, spoken of only in code, avoided even by vagrants. Its windows shattered inward instead of out, as if something had escaped, not broken in. Its chimneys exhaled ash even in summer, and its doorknobs remained warm long after the fires had gone cold. But the strangest part wasn't what was left behind. It was how the house behaved, as if it remembered not just who had lived within it, but who had died beneath it. In the following years, a string of would-be owners tried to claim the estate. A doctor from Harrisburg, a widowed deacon, even a group of early spiritualists who thought they could turn the location into a seance retreat. All of them vanished within months, not disappeared, but unraveled. One returned to town crawling on all fours, speaking a dialect no one recognized. Another walked into the church with no eyes, only 2 burning black sockets that never bled. He screamed only one word: recalled. The property, it seemed, had memory. Visitors who stepped across the threshold often reported intense déjà vu, memories they never lived, feelings they couldn't place. A journalist who entered the master bedroom claimed to remember nursing a dying child, though she had never born one. A priest, before collapsing in the parlor, spoke of hiding tools beneath the floorboards, tools used to silence a child in 1803, though he couldn't have been alive then. Some believed the house had absorbed every sin, every secret ever whispered in its walls, that it was a vessel, not a home, a confessional turned carnivore. Others said it had become a mirror of guilt itself, a place where your shadow lived more honestly than you did, and every time someone entered, it rearranged itself to show them the one room they'd hoped not to find, and then came the blood moss. A red, velvet-like growth began, to form across the walls, especially near the cellar door. It pulsed in moonlight. It was warm to the touch, and when scraped away, words appeared underneath, etched in the original foundation stone. Names, phrases, numbers. A full calendar of burials that never made it into any town ledger. Some dated centuries before the Marrows arrived. One name appeared repeatedly, Isadora, written always in reverse, sometimes in mirror script. By 1830, the land had grown barren. The soil wouldn't hold seed, animals refused to cross it. Even insects avoided the perimeter. Local children spoke of a girl who lived in the attic window, smiling, even when the glass was broken. No one had been in the attic for years. The stairs had collapsed, the door was nailed shut. But the girl, they said, always watched. And sometimes, she waved. When a storm hit the valley in 1833 and lightning struck the home directly, the house burned, but only on the outside. The flames rolled across the outer walls, eating paint, boiling windows. But inside, everything remained untouched, chairs unmoved, coffins undisturbed, candles still flickering. Because fire cannot forget what remembers itself. And the house, it remembers you. Long after the Marrow house was abandoned and condemned, scavengers and amateur historians began to steal into its crumbling shell, looking for artifacts, secrets, or proof of the stories that had spread like rot through Pennsylvania. One such man, a former seminary student turned grave historian named Lawrence Greaves, came in search of bones. What he found instead was a book, half-burnt, bound in flayed hide, and tucked beneath the altar of the ruined embalming room. It wasn't a Bible, it wasn't even in English. It was a ledger, a careful chronological record of every coffin built, every burial performed, and every soul handled by the Marrow family from 1801 until 1825. But unlike the public cemetery logs filed with the town registrar, this ledger contained entries that were never meant to be seen. Each page listed not only the name and age of the deceased, but a column marked "State of Transit." Most entries were noted with chilling precision. Breath halted, spirit unclear, vessel prepared, host still listening, or worse, sealed prematurely, by request. And among these grotesque eulogies were names that should not have been there, people still alive, children not yet born, entire families listed as interred before they ever appeared in census records. It was as if the ledger was not just recording death, but dictating it, writing it into place. Lawrence Greaves photographed several pages and sent them to a professor at Yale for translation. The response he received was brief and terrified. "This is not a ledger, this is a ritual, a recursive document. To read it aloud is to agree to its terms." That same week, Greaves vanished. His last email, sent at 3:17 a.m., read, "My reflection is not in the window anymore, but something is watching me from it." What little survived of the book was later acquired by a Catholic archivist from Scranton, who attempted to riot in consecrated soil. The priest who blessed the ground died of cardiac arrest before the sun rose. The page detailing Isadora's burial, the girl whose name appeared dozens of times across the ledger, was written not in ink, but something darker. Microscopically, it was not blood. It was spinal fluid, human, preserved. And the ink moved when no one watched it. Even more horrifying were the margins. Along the edges of the pages, scrawled by a different hand in tiny script, were messages, seemingly from the deceased themselves. Some pleaded, "Let me finish sleeping." Others threatened, "I have seen your face and I remember." But the worst was repeated throughout the book in Latin, Hebrew, and corrupted Greek. The coffin is not for the dead, it is for the secret they carried. To this day, the original ledger is sealed in a temperature-controlled vault under St. Hildegard's monastery. It is said that during storms, the metal of the vault door groans. The guards refuse to stay near it after midnight, and the camera watching the vault flickers. Because some books are not meant to be opened, some names are not meant to be written, and it was only after the 12th excavation of the Marrow property in 1902, almost 80 years after the last recorded burial, that authorities dared break into the final sealed area of the estate, a stone-encased root cellar deep beneath the main structure, untouched by fire, rot, or time. It was no ordinary storage chamber. The walls were lined with copper etchings, symbols foreign to any local folklorist but familiar to students of pre-Egyptian death cults. The floor was not dirt, but black glass. Not obsidian, glass, as if fire had once swept through this room with such intensity that it turned the earth itself to mirror. By the time forensic historians from the University of Pittsburgh returned to Grisham's Hollow in 1929, the town had tried everything to erase its past. The old Marrow estate had been declared a historical hazard, the surrounding land fenced off by rusted wire and cursed by rumor. But what they couldn't bury was the silence. No birds nested there, no wind moved through the trees, and nothing decomposed, not fully. It was in the ruins of the original mortuary stables, half submerged in black soil, that the team discovered the ossuary. But this was no sacred chamber. It was a pit, a crude hand-dug vault lined with jawbones, femurs, and hundreds of finger bones meticulously arranged in spirals. But stranger than the quantity was the condition. The bones were still moist, not damp from rain, not soft from rot, but living, as if they'd been extracted minutes before. When touched, they pulsed faintly beneath the fingertips, and beneath one set of ribs, child-sized, there was a cocoon. Human hair wrapped tight around a lump of wax with teeth pressed into it, still warm. The team's lead, Dr. Marshall Eddings, removed only a single item, a half-skull with an iron spike driven through the crown, still humming at a near infrasonic frequency. They brought it to the university lab for study. That was a mistake. Within 72 hours, 2 students had gone missing. One was found in the library basement, eyes scooped out and replaced with wads of hair. The other was never found, but on the inside of the lab's storage freezer, written in what appeared to be burnt marrow, was a single phrase: "Send me back. They're still hungry." The bone pit was closed off once again, this time under federal order. But in the following weeks, strange reports leaked through local papers, animals digging obsessively at the ground above the site, children waking up with dirt in their mouths and scratches beneath their fingernails, a farmer whose cows all lay facing east one morning, their tongues gnawed off, their ears packed with soot. He burned down his barn and disappeared into the woods that same night, leaving only a note nailed to his door. The bones are not bones. They're pieces of something that remembers. Later, analysis of the pit site found no evidence of tools, no cut marks. Every bone had been separated not by blade, but by heat and pressure, as if the bodies had been boiled from within and twisted apart before death. Some even showed signs of reassembly, femurs belonging to different age groups, skulls whose dental patterns didn't match their cranial size. Something, or someone, was not just burying the dead here. It was building something from them. And then there were the voices. Dozens of voice recordings made by the research team had been left running overnight, capturing hours of static. But when played backward, the static wasn't random. It formed syllables, repeating, chanting, whispering one name over and over in a tongue older than any language still spoken. Isadora. 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 In 1947, Father Mark Ewan, a Jesuit-trained demonologist and reluctant historian of American hauntings, returned to the grounds of the Marrow estate for one final investigation. He had no funding, no team, only a single photograph, mailed to him without return address, showing the Marrow death book, open to a final page that had never been catalogued. A name had been added in fresh ink. Not a descendant, not a historian. It was his own. He arrived at dusk. The land was still, but the wind had begun to hum again, and the trees leaned unnaturally toward the center of the ruins. The foundation stones of the house remained like rotted teeth, circling a dark pit where the cellar had been. No wildlife, no insects, just the taste of metal on the air and the sound of something shifting beneath the soil, too slow to be mechanical, too rhythmic to be animal. Ewan descended with nothing but a lantern and a crucifix. What he recorded in his journal was never published but leaked through the archives of the Diocese of Altoona-Johnstown decades later. According to his notes, the cellar had changed. The stairs no longer ended at a door, but at a page, floating mid-air, written in blood that rearranged itself as he watched. The page read not his name, but a question. What did you bury to become who you are? The chamber was no longer stone, it was flesh. The walls pulsed, the mirrors were back, but now they didn't reflect a room. They reflected memories that weren't his. Women stitched shut and kept beneath floorboards. Twins with mouths sealed in wax. An entire congregation buried upright in the chapel basement, singing with no tongues. And then came the name. Not Isadora, not Elias, but the name behind all names, carved into the stone with no tools, just gouged by what could only be described as desperate, loving fingers. A name so old it predated English. It translated loosely to "she who waits between coffins." She wasn't dead, she wasn't alive. She was in between, like everything in the Marrow family had been, kept in stasis, in secrets, in silence. All she had needed was someone to remember, someone to write her name, someone to say it out loud. Ewan's final entry reads, "The coffin isn't buried in the earth is buried in the coffin. We live inside it, we always have. We are not the mourners, we are the mourned." He was never seen again. Weeks later, townspeople reported seeing a man in priestly garb walking the edge of the estate, barefoot, eyes stitched shut with rosary thread, mouth whispering into the soil. The grass where he walked never grew again. Today, the land is undeveloped, still listed under the ownership of Marrow Sons, a company that has not existed since 1873, and the last page of the death book, sealed in the Jesuit vaults in Pennsylvania, changes names every year, names of those who've read too deeply, names of those who remember, and maybe now yours too.